Good morning, everyone, and welcome to you, Chief Constable, your second board meeting and officially first since appointment as substantive Chief Constable. Welcome to your team, and also welcome to Graham Bigger, Director General of the National Crime Agency, who joins us today to give us his update report to the board. There are lots of issues of note in both reports and questions on a range of events. We're fast approaching year end and the PSNI financial position remains precarious with gaps in funding and other pressures facing the organisation. There's still an outstanding pay settlement for officers, and this month the board supported the business case for the revised environmental allowance. But we know these are affordability issues within the budget we have for the year. It is also clear that your report that demands on the organisation continue to increase, and reducing officer numbers is having an impact on operational resilience. On a positive note, there's much in your report around good policing work, and indeed the report of the Independent Commission this week recognised the impact collective law enforcement effort is having on tackling paramilitarism, but it stressed how crucial neighbourhood policing is to tackling paramilitarism. As a board, we too support the need for continued investment in these teams across communities. So, Chief Constable, if we're going to hand over to you for opening remarks, and then we'll take some questions from the board.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome, Graham, as well to this meeting. Thank you. And just to echo the opening remarks that you made, I think to put this properly on the record, I do just want to take a few minutes just to talk about the issues that I've highlighted in my forward, because we are reaching a position now where there's been lots of dialogue, I think, in recent months, and we need to move into some action about what we're going to do because of our financial position. So I just want to, if I can, pull out some of the things that I've written about in my forward. So obviously the last couple of months I've had a chance to get around the organisation even more, see more and more people, and I have to again reinforce that the quality of policing and the values-driven approach to the delivery on the front line is exceptional. Whilst I was travelling around the other day, a number of aggravated burglars were arrested at scene. We had TSG officers who had administered Narcan and performed CPR on an unresponsive male in Belfast whilst I was travelling around. All this happens on a daily basis. It is outstanding what they're doing. But it's worth commenting as 2023 draws to a close, I think, on some of the positives, but also the challenges that we're facing, because it is going to direct our policing stance in the future. So we've seen in the last 12 months, policing that's delivered basically one of the safest places to live in the country in Northern Ireland. The recent Peel HMIC report set out that, and we know crimes per capita for individual in Northern Ireland are lower than most other places because of the work that we do with partners. We also saw, of course, the anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement and President Biden's visit, and what was seen, I think, globally as an exceptional police operation in making sure that all those events occurred seamlessly. A number of protected persons were obviously here. With regards to all of those achievements, though, recognising them, it's not lost on me the challenges that there have been in the last 12 months. We had the cowardly attack on John Caldwell in February. The threat level here has gone from substantial to severe. And that is something that obviously our police officers and staff live with every day. Connect to that, we faced the largest crisis in the police service's history with regards to the information breach and disclosure breach following the publication of material following a Freedom of Information request. And again, the implications of that linked to the attack on John, linked to the sense of security of the police family of the PSNI should not be lost on anybody. And then we've got these huge financial pressures. And I did read with interest the Lady Chief Justice opening of term address, where she talked about the investment in the last 12 years of health going up almost 70%, education 45%, but for criminal justice, the increase in budget has been 3%. And I say that with a caveat that I understand the challenges and the pressures on health and education, I really do. But a confident and prosperous society in Northern Ireland is predicated on a safe Northern Ireland. Police officer numbers in Northern Ireland, the PSNI, are going down now to the lowest that they've ever been. We simply will not be able to provide the policing services that you're accustomed to moving forward over the next 12 months unless we have some financial interventions. It's simply not tenable to go down to the numbers. So you will be aware that when the organisation began and the work of Patton set the size of the organisation to be approximately at 7,500. The New Decade, New Approach agreement in 2020 reaffirmed those commitments, and we had an outline business case with the Department of Justice that agreed funding for 7,500 officers. Now, we've done work since then that sets the size of the organisation anywhere between 7,000 and 7,500. We know we've got to re-engineer that work, and that has begun. Okay. But by the end of March of 2024, we'll be at 6,358. And if we continue in that trajectory, we will go below 6,000 police officers in the beginning of 2025. And that, for me, is simply that's not acceptable. That's not. We can't do that. We've got to have some really honest conversations about where this is going. There's been plenty of letters that I've seen that have been exchanged between different departments about funding. And I know some of this is beyond the control of my role and this board, but we really have got to start to socialise the issues that we're facing if we're going to get the interventions that we require. We are at a tipping point, in my professional judgment, and I am determined that we will start recruitment in April to address this decline in numbers. We're also, of course, losing people that we ordinarily wouldn't lose. Some of that is linked to the cost of living crisis and the fact that we are being told, although I think the conversation needs to be not that we're unable to pay the 7% increase recommended by the pay review board, but how do we pay it to our officers? Because we're getting to a position where police officers can't afford to be police officers. We're the emergency service of last resort. When other emergency services run out, which I have huge support for, our colleagues in fire, in ambulance, I have huge admiration and support for the exceptional work that health provides, especially with regards to mental health services. But we will not be able to do some of the things that we are currently being asked to do. Only this weekend, we're providing 2 PSUs to the Met Police because of the disorder challenges and protest challenges that they face. Some of these things we simply are not going to be able to respond to. We are seeing officers leave in unprecedented numbers. We lose 60 to 70 a month through retirements, which obviously we can predict and expect. But I've spoken to a number of officers. I've got countless now anecdotal stories of why they are leaving the organisation. It's not all linked to money, and I accept that. There are other factors that we are addressing which may get teased out in questions. And we are addressing those factors, and I am seeing a shift in attitudes towards those issues. But we need this organisation to be properly funded, and we need to pay our officers the 7% increase recommended by the pay review board. They deserve it, and I'm determined that they're going to get it. Earlier this year, we also conducted, March and April period, the Your Service, Your Voice audit. In that audit, and I know we mentioned it previously, only in brief at the last policing board meeting, some of the issues I've just mentioned were highlighted in that audit. But what I'm pleased to say, what again it shows, is that the values-driven approach, the discretionary effort, the can-do attitude, the brigading of resources to make sure that we can deal with any crisis that faces this organisation is there. It's still there. But as we lose more officers, And as we put more pressure on the officers that remain, things like our sickness rates will increase. I think we may have seen a plateauing of that, by the way, and we may get into that in questions. But it is clearly the time to start to take a different approach around lobbying for the funding this organisation needs. Only yesterday I spoke to the chair of the Association of Police and Crime Commissioners. Now I know our funding mechanism comes from a different line, but we need to lobby anybody and everybody about the issues that we're facing here. And I did that in front of all the chief constables in England and Wales and Scotland, and nobody realised our position. Nobody understood the position here. More and more people will begin to understand it as we finish this calendar year and move into the new year. But we've got to start to have a plan to address these issues. So there will be some uncomfortable conversations moving forward, but I don't think the board or I will shy away from those. And in order to maintain the excellence that we see in policing in Northern Ireland, this organisation has got to be properly funded. And that is going to be my main strategic priority moving forward. Okay. Now, very happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Chief Constable. I'm going to start with John on attacks on Belfast Multicultural Association. John.
Chief Constable, thank you for your report today. You will have seen the media coverage recently over police responses to attacks on Belfast Multicultural Association in recent years, when it appears that users of that building and association were asked to give assurances around worship, or as the case may be, non-worship. Can I ask you what has been done to rectify anything that may have gone wrong there? And in addition, build relations with multicultural associations?
So you may be aware this is a territory that I'm accustomed to with regards to minority communities facing intimidation. I will say this: far more joins us as different communities in society than separates us. And I watched the Spotlight programme. My heart sunk with regards to what Mr. Atif said and how he felt the organisation had let him down. I know these events go back to a period in 2020, and I saw Finola do an exceptional job, Finola Doran, the superintendent, in speaking on the programme about the work that she's now doing to make sure that we are alive to any issues of any hate ideology, any hatred whatsoever in society towards any minority groups. I have asked Finn to ensure that I get an opportunity to meet Mr. Atif. There are all sorts of things in play now that I won't talk about relocation of that charity, and we'll be looking to support them and provide them reassurances around their safety. Listen, this is something that we can never take our foot off the ball with regards to any hatred. If you look at what happened only on the 23rd of November in Dublin, where people can react very quickly in a way that none of us want to see, in an absolutely unacceptable and cowardly way because of misinformation. And that is something that we are determined through the work of the neighbourhood policing and the work that Bobby's doing to make sure that we get ahead of. Okay, so we've got some recovery to do there, I accept that. I think that has begun. Speaking to Finn over the last few months, and actually the cultural audit talks about the work that we're doing in communities now that is seen as fresh, new, more positive. But we need to speak to Mr. Atif. We need to make sure that he feels comfortable and confident moving forward, and that will be done. But this isn't, this isn't going to be about one meeting. This is about a series of interactions with our communities to make sure they feel that confidence. Okay. What I will say is where we see any criminality, and I asked some probing questions about that particular series of incidents that were showed in the programme. There were arrests made. Files did go to the Public Prosecution Service. There was determinations not to prosecute in those cases. But that's where we will be ensuring that we've got all our endeavour moving forward as well around the sanction of anybody who displays those behaviours, and we will investigate those thoroughly. I can assure you of that. But can I just bring in Bobby to see if there's anything further that Bobby wants to talk about on that?
Sure, thanks, Chief, and thanks, John, for the question. So yeah, those two incidents, 14 months apart, a number of years ago now, two arson attacks on the premises itself, but also a number of other related hate crimes. So just by way of reassurance around the initial policing response at that time, a critical incident structure was established. There were detective-led investigations of both the arsons and a number of those other hate crimes, which were treated as a linked series. As the Chiefs mentioned, we had 2 people arrested for the 2021 attack, and that was following the recovery of CCTV. As the Chiefs pointed out, a file did go to the PPS, but it was deemed that the prosecutorial threshold had not been met in terms of the evidence that was presented. I can assure the board that all lines of investigation in relation to both of those fires and the linked series incidents have been exhausted by detectives. With regard to the Spotlight programme itself, you've alluded to it. Clearly, there was a narrative that was presented and inferences drawn from extracts of what turned out, or it appears to have been anyway, a covertly recorded meeting between police and community representatives. Obviously, what has been presented in Spotlight is of concern to us. It's a concern to the public, to this board and our partners. Police were not told in advance of the Spotlight programme that the recording existed. We were given a right of reply, but I'll say this, it was fairly limited. At this point in time, we'll be looking to engage with the BBC and seeking their support in terms of gaining access, not only to the broadcast material, but the unbroadcast material, to make sure that the inferences made have been properly and fully investigated and examined. By way of the recovery piece that you've talked about, I mean, a great deal of work has been done over the last 2 years, and in particular since these specific events. You'll remember as well, around this same time, we had criticism specifically of the organisation's handling as well, Black Lives Matter protests, and a great deal of investment and time and effort has gone into improving the relationship specifically with the Black and minority ethnic community. That's involved officers and staff at all levels of the organisation, but including our strategic community engagement team, which was one of the teams that was set up in response to some of those findings. The BMCA members have actually been at the heart of a great deal of that engagement over the last 2 years. We proactively engaged with them, and we're well aware, I have to say, of their disappointment. So this didn't come as a surprise, their commentary, whenever we heard it on the Spotlight programme. We understand in particular their disappointment that nobody was made amenable for the attacks. And actually, maybe somewhat ironically, as recently as last week, I think it was last Wednesday, we were actually with members of BMCA at an event which they were contributing to at the Belfast Islamic Society. It was a cultural awareness session that we had organised for some time with them, and that's all about making sure that our local police commanders are fully attuned to the needs and sensitivities around individual communities. We did, I have to say as well, provide an overview of all our ongoing work to tackle hate crime, and in particular the incidents that we've seen in South Belfast to Spotlight. But regrettably, that didn't form much of any part of the programme. Superintendent Dornan, as the Chief said, continues to lead our local response in these matters under Operation Isophene, which we've previously spoken to you about here at the board. And more broadly, we're continuing to manage community tensions across Northern Ireland through what we're calling Operation Agnosia. And those tensions, as we've seen, are largely focused in terms of concerns around the availability of social housing and its interface with newcomers to Northern Ireland.
Chair, can I just add one thing, Chair? Sorry. So what did strike me watching the programme was when Mr. Atif talked about, on his own volition, thinking he should pay people for protection. I plea with anybody, conscious this is the public session, anybody who feels any sorts of intimidation like that, any sense of helplessness, come to us, talk to us. We'll speak to Mr. Atif, we'll learn lessons, but we will deal with these people. We are the police, and I'm making that ever more clearer. We will deal with these people. So I just would appeal to anybody who may have any experiences like this to please come forward and see us, okay? And not in any way to consider paying any of these people.
Okay, Chief Constable. John, is that okay? Yeah. Then an extension to this question from Peter.
Thanks, Chair. And it just occurs to me as you're responding to that one particular question to see if we can get some assurance on. I haven't seen the Spotlight programme, but I did read some newspaper comments on it, presumably just before the programme. And I am very conscious of some of the very positive work that goes on between the PSNI and some of those minority ethnic and other minority groups. And it's all very positive. And I also don't like a recording being made without people's knowledge, and then 2 years later it comes back. And I think there are questions and thoughts in my mind about that aren't necessarily positive. But I'm also conscious that there are things like posters going up in some communities that are racist in their intent, that are intimidatory. I don't believe the majority of people in any community necessarily agrees with those things, but nevertheless, demographic change presents challenges. I suspect when those posters go up, there's more of a correlation between the posters going up and paramilitarism or prescribed organizations than there is anything about those communities per se. Can you provide some assurance that either 2 or 3 years ago or now, the PSNI was not in the business of saying to those groups, go and deal with the gatekeepers, go and mediate with the gatekeepers, potentially paramilitary organizations, to see if you can get permission from them, because if you get permission from them, everything will be okay. That should not be the role of the PSNI or any other public body, because other laws govern these things rather than talking to the gatekeepers to get their okay for things. And that just empowers them. So can you provide some assurance that either 2 or 3 years ago, or the intent this time, it was not go and get the okay from the chaps who matter?
So I'll go first. I will bring Bobby in. I think from my comments already about these behaviours, these criminal behaviours, and what needs to happen should reflect my position that there is no place for this in society. We would not encourage in any way, shape or form any of the sorts of conversations that I heard in that recording. Now, I've asked about the officers that are in that recording. There are some issues there that I won't speak about now, just to understand why they said what they said, who they are. I think the officers involved are now retired. And listen, there's two sides to every story. And I talk about a learning culture and not a blame culture. But we should be no doubt that we let Mr. Atif down. Okay, we let that charity down. And there are links. There is a theme from the previous board meeting, from what we saw in Dublin, and with the attack on those poor children and their teacher at the end of November. The posters, the hatred that is currently emerging around people who are immigrating here for a safe place to live, the right-wing extremism narrative. There is a link to a lot of this that we're very alive to, and we are determined to get ahead of. With the English Defence League and Britain First, I've had this before, attacking Muslim communities, and we've dealt with it in fairly imaginative ways by getting injunctions against people being able to operate. So nothing's going to be off the table. But what you need to see is actual actions from this organisation around these people. So I can reassure you that over the forthcoming months, you will see the tangible work that I think Finola and the team have been doing to provide you with tangible reassurance that we won't engage in anything like that, and we'll deal with these people. And we'll deal with these people robustly. But I'll bring Bobby in on that.
Yeah, thanks, Chief. And I mean, I would just again reassure members of the board that where we have reports of hate crimes or hate incidents, there is a robust process in place for responding to those. And in fact, a recent audit carried out here by the National Leads for Hate Crime provided very favourable evidence in terms of the organisation's effectiveness in handling of that. Yeah, Peter, I mean, we're not in the business of asking paramilitaries for their acquiescence in allowing communities to settle in areas that just doesn't happen. In this particular instance, there were community tensions over an extended period of time. I think there was a suggestion that perhaps the community felt they had been given previous assurances about the use of the premises, and then perhaps there was some tension that arose from that. Look, what we've heard is an excerpt of a meeting. I think we need to hear the whole meeting before we can reach any conclusions about what was actually said. But that's something now that, again, cooperating with the programme makers and potentially with the police ombudsman needs to be robustly and fully investigated.
And Chair, I'm going to do this once more. Sorry, the PCTF do some outstanding work. I visited them last Friday. The Independent Reporting Commission's report that's just come out evidences that, talks about the great work the neighbourhood policing teams are doing with regards to combating paramilitarism, but also the work that the PCTF are doing to make sure that this is, I'm hoping, an unusual story, is an exceptional story. The mainstream work that we've been doing against paramilitaries is really paying off, and the report shows the cumulative effect of that, of which we're one part, but talks very positively about the PSNI's history, recent record in dealing with paramilitaries.
Okay, thank you, Chief Constable. I have two quick questions from Mukesh and then Anula on this issue.
Thank you, Chair. Just to go back to the Spotlight programme, and I'm conscious that you're still looking at the recordings and trying to establish what else was said and what might not have been reported. There seemed to be a lack of cultural awareness from the officer that spoke, in that he seemed to be endorsing the fact that if somebody's carrying a prayer mat, he's visiting a mosque. And that's not true, because as we know, the Islamic community do pray several times a day, and that could be in their house, it could be at an airport, it could be anywhere. So the question is there adequate cultural awareness training going on within the PSNI to try and make sure that there's a better understanding of the needs and how different religions and cultures do operate, whether it's in a religious setting or in their own cultural celebrations?
So I don't know the answer to that question, if I'm honest, at this point in time. I will say a lot of my closest friends are Muslim and have prayed at my house. So I'm aware that you don't take a prayer mat just to a mosque. And I think I am certain that our organisation, the members of the organisation know that. But this is one of those things that we've constantly got to work at. So I recognise part of the cultural audit that we did wasn't a single strand of what we're doing around culture. There need to be a number of layers that come beyond that, looking at issues like this and the learning. In the cultural audit, we may talk about that today. There was nothing really talked about with regards to misogyny. They're questions that I've been asking about, having met the Women in Policing Association. So all I can say to you is, I promise you we'll learn the lessons. We'll speak to Mr. Ateek, we'll speak to others. And if there is a need for further training, we will provide training. It's something that we should have embedded in the organisational culture moving forward. So it's something we should live and breathe. There is a plan to do a series of engagements with the entire workforce, police staff and police officers next year. And this might be one of those things that we include in the agenda as to what we're doing. But I don't know if anybody else wants to come in on that. No? Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, just to say, we do have equality, diversity and inclusion training, which we regard as compliance training for all our staff and officers. I think we also know we have to continuously improve that and keep that up to date and equip our officers and our staff so that they are confident in dealing with all of the communities that we serve. It's also obviously a key part to the foundation training in the college, but something that we're continuously developing and learning from so that our officers are equipped and confident.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. And quickly, Neil, on this one.
Yeah, no, well, at the last board session, we did talk about the posters that were being erected and that were racist and also incited violence too. I know that I can be critical of the police, but I just wanted to highlight that there was a quick response from the senior team to remove posters in particular across North Belfast. So I just wanted to put on record, particularly with liaison with Bobby Singleton, that the police did take swift action and that was done, and I think that should be noted. So thank you for that.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to move on to another question now from Gerry on the cultural audit and a supplemental from Neil on this. Gerry.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Chief Constable, for your presentation. I think you mentioned some of this earlier, but the cultural audit, we got a briefing on it, and one of the things that struck me was that if I could use the term, sort of the elephant in the room of misogyny and sectarianism didn't have a huge place in it. I think misogyny was mentioned once. I also, let me say this, I know that there's ongoing work on this, but could you give some notion of what the plan is, the action plan in terms of that? I think you mentioned misogyny earlier on, and maybe into that, when Claire was talking about the training, and I know it's in the foundation course in training as you go in, but how often is that updated for police officers? And just let me finish. I mean, what happens inside the PSNI obviously has an impact outside, so that's why it's so important, I think, that what is happening inside, what is combating that.
Okay, so firstly, with regards to cultural audit, I mean, as I've said, it was a good piece of work. It was the beginning. When I say it was the beginning, it's the most recent key piece of work around what the culture feels like in the organisation from the members of the organisation. It didn't specifically deal with certain issues that we need to probe. That's going to come. That would include misogyny. If there is any sectarianism, I've asked the question when we last met, Gerry, about this with the organisation for any examples. And I'm meeting with the Catholic Guild around this. Jerry Murray, I've had brief conversations with about what his concerns are within the organisation. Is there any fears in the organisation with regards to Catholic officers, and any examples of misconduct or wrongdoing that I need to look at and address, and go and see people and make sure again that in the sessions that we're going to do into 2024 with the entire organisation, that we could include Gerry and others in demonstrating and educating people around any such issues. So, this is one of the things, like painting the Forth Road Bridge. You never stop working on culture. And if you do, it's at your peril in any organisation, particularly a large organisation. The HMIC did give us a grading of good for the way the organisation deals with vetting and issues of misconduct. So that's a reassurance piece where these issues are highlighted. What I'm always a little bit concerned about is what's not being highlighted. Now, in the surveying that the HMIC did, of I think over 300 members of staff, this is for the Peel effectiveness report, there were some positive indications from that surveying. Over 50, I think it was about 55%. And the question was, has the organisation improved its culture in the last 10 years? And 55% said it's definitely improved its culture in the last 10 years. There was questions about, would you feel confident to put your hand up around any concerns about behaviours within the organisation? Again, very positive answers. But there are still elements that aren't confident. So we need to deal with that. We need to have conversations. I've met all of the support networks that look after minority groups within the organisation. I've met them collectively, and I'm now in a series of meetings with them individually, because they all have their bespoke issues that they want to talk about. Some of that needs to be done discreetly, about issues that they want to highlight, that they don't want to go more widely into the organisation. So all I can do is reassure you, and if you about these issues, and if you see or hear or have any examples of anything, and this is part of the mechanism of dealing with this, we need to know. We need people to tell us so we can deal with it, and deal with those things in a way, by the way, that respects the privacy of those individuals who raise these issues. I'm not going to go into it now. I've been given a couple of examples that are very old of behaviours that cause me concern, but I'm getting the detail on those and I'll deal with them, but they are a number of years ago. So we'll keep pushing on it. I very much welcome any open dialogue with you and others about any concerns you've got of individual cases, to make sure all of our staff feel confident in the organisation. But I'll probably pause there and hand over to Claire as to any further input.
Yeah, thank you. Just a couple of additional aspects based on your question. So there was one section in the cultural audit. It was called having aligned expectations, but it was the cultural driver that asked some questions about ethical behaviour, about support for people to speak up about wrongdoing, about a learning culture and admitting mistakes, and about individuals being held to account. So that has given us some indication about the areas that we can work on further, as the Chief has described. And again, we are able to understand from those who did respond to that survey, over 4,000 of the workforce, as you know, participated in the cultural audit. There are some free text questions that were asked where the workforce were able to say the areas that they believe that we should focus on moving forward. So we've got a baseline, but also some very valuable detail from the workforce directly about those areas pertaining to conduct, behaviour, wrongdoing, and a learning culture. A couple of other things just to reference. You'll know from previous updates that the service executive team have previously made a statement of action, a very clear statement of action about any inappropriate conduct and behaviour and how that will be dealt with seriously, expediently and formally. And that, I suppose, comes at the latter end of the spectrum, because whilst it's critically important that we do that, we have to create an environment where any detection of behaviour of that nature is addressed at a very early stage, so that the environment is conducive to great employee relations. And indeed, in the last 12 months, we have refreshed our suite of, if I call them, dignity at work procedures, which has a very clear step in it about calling out any behaviour that might, have an indication that it would be inappropriate in any way in the workplace, and how those are handled and dealt with at the earliest possible opportunity and at the lowest possible level. I think another part of your question was around how do we move forward on the back of the cultural audit, more generally, and what will be our action plan. So we're being very deliberate that we're in a period, I suppose, of intense engagement with all of our staff associations. So last week we met with colleagues from NIPSA, the Police Federation, Superintendents Association, and all of the minority and diversity staff associations through our Your Voice forum. And that was really just to say, here are the findings, and we want to hear what you think about that and what areas that you think we need to work on and how we move forward. And we got some, consistent themes coming out of those conversations. One, for example, was about linking the findings to the real issues that staff and officers are facing. An obvious one being pay and conditions. So linking this, to the very specific areas that impact them on a day-to-day basis. And also one of the questions in the survey, which was a free text, was, state one thing that you would like to see changed in the culture and the workplace in PSNI. And the thing that came out top in that was actually around more investment in development. And the second one was to do with pay, and the third one was greater support for employee well-being. So those are the areas that I would imagine that when we get into the new year, we'll be starting to think about how we focus on those. Finally, I think without exception, our colleagues were saying we don't want an extra additional action plan. This has to become part of how we do our business. So how we focus on this is how we lead, how we manage, how we work with each other, and what we do every day.
Okay.
Thank you for that. And one of the questions was around how often, because you've said that it's an ongoing process. Sometimes say people talk about human rights, so I've heard this many times. Oh, that we deal with that every day. Doesn't mean anything. So when you ask the question, how often is that updated? That's an action plan. That is, is it dealt with when there's an incident? Is it dealt with I know it's dealt with in the college, dealt with very well, but the colleges, I think, they make it around 22 weeks training. So that's what the question was about. You've said a number of times, and I've met you before this, Chief Constable, about the learning culture and not the blame culture, and that concept appeals to me. But just with this caveat, that if there is if there's wrongdoing, it doesn't mean to say that you have to bring it to its top level or anything like that, but it still has to be dealt with. I mean, that's just the point I would make in that. And a lot of the talk today, and I agree with it, I would come in myself, but it's very well taken care of by other members around the ethnic minorities and the issues around that. We are more and more in the cultural society. Both women and Catholics are a huge section of the community in the first place, and also within policing. So I am getting, and I can tell you, there are people coming to me about things like this, and I do think at times it's very hard for them to raise this stuff because of peer pressure, because they worry about the careers, etc., etc. And I presume that's part of what they're dealing with. But thank you.
Okay, thank you. Members, I'm just going to say there's great discussion going on, and we are going to overrun. I'm just going to let people know that, or whatever. I don't want to curb debate and discussion. Can I go to Joanne on officer extractions from neighbourhood teams?
Thanks, Chair. Chief Constable, firstly, I think you've made some sobering and alarming remarks and included in your forward about officer numbers. I think it's important that we put on the record our support for you. There were agreements that there should be 7,500 officers, and we support that and will advocate on your behalf to ensure that commitment is met. My question relates to extraction. This board and your senior executive team have given a commitment to neighbourhood policing. We all understand the importance of neighbourhood policing. However, increasingly, I am hearing from communities and indeed neighbourhood officers themselves a degree of frustration at the levels and extent of extraction of neighbourhood teams and other areas of business. Could I ask what monitoring there is of the extent of extraction, despite the policy that neighbourhoods should not be extracted unless it's a last resort? And is this going to fall into the operational review?
So we've got lots of data, so I'm confident we'll have the data around the extractions. I'll come to Bobby and others around that. But, you know, I made a commitment at the last meeting to neighbourhood policing because I realised the importance of it. If you don't get the neighbourhood policing right, all you do, and that's working with partners, and I've seen this, I've experienced the implications of not doing neighbourhood policing are not obvious when you first realise you've got to cut resources, cut numbers, cut your workforce. That's what our money, now 80% of our money is workforce, is people. So that's where we find savings generally. To abstract or remove people from neighbourhood policing, it shifts the problem and it worsens the problem. That has been proven now repeatedly in policing. We've learned those lessons in the last 5, 10, 15 years. What I can't do is give commitments because of the broad church of responsibilities we have, the disorder that, you know, we have to support and protest we have to support with regards to the policing family and the different and diverse elements of the threats that we face today. And by and large, those resources for that uniform presence comes from neighbourhood officers, it does. But what we need to do is make sure that we get our biggest bang for our buck with that and that we limit it as far as we possibly can. Because if they're not in the communities doing that role, then the consequences not as dire as not having them there, but you're still feeding the challenge of not dealing with these issues. So I am committed to neighbourhood policing. Bobby has done some, and we've had a couple of discussions on this and his team, some excellent work around the shift patterns in neighbourhoods response, around the numbers, to make sure that we are as efficient as we possibly can be moving forward. And that will help protect neighbourhood policing in the broader piece of work. That is going to help inform the broader piece of work that we are going to have to do around the discussion about what our operating model is going to be. What are our aims as a PSNI? What are our responsibilities? For me, that's keeping people safe, particularly vulnerable people. And this might show my age, but I still believe in fighting crime. We're crime fighters. We're supposed to stop crime. We're supposed to arrest people who are responsible for crime and put them through the criminal justice system. where we've got officers, and this will be relevant to your question, who are spending 8-10 hours babysitting people with mental health issues in a hospital, and then get seen by a doctor and told, well, there's no need for you to be detained here. There's no need for you to stay within the hospital. And then we just let them go. We can't do that anymore. So the right care, right person, that if you look at the College of Policing website, there's a toolkit around right care, right person, from the experiences of forces like Humberside and the Met. You know, Humberside saved something like 15,000 hours in policing. The calculations are that a year, 1 million hours can be saved in England alone, looking at a different approach to dealing with mental health issues. Those are the abstractions we are going to address. And that is conversations, difficult conversations moving forward with partners in health. Because we aren't skilled to do that. We don't join the police to do that. So those issues we need to address with partners, and that will help with some of those abstractions. But I'll pass the microphone to Bobby to talk more about it.
Yeah, thanks, Chief. Joanne, thanks for the question. This is obviously something we've spoke to the board a lot about at Partnership Committee. And indeed, we've done quite a bit of show and tell as well with neighbourhood officers coming to that committee. And we've always encouraged them to be honest with the board, and we've been honest with the board as well about the issue of abstractions. We are hearing this concern very loudly from our own teams. We see that through the neighbourhood self-assessment that we do as part of outcome 3 of the board report. Again, it would be fair to say over the last 3 years of that reporting, we've seen it steadily increase as a concern for teams and the key obstacle to them doing the job that they want to be doing in terms of problem solving. You're right to say that we did have a policy on abstractions, and we are in the process of strengthening our ability to monitor abstractions. I have to say there is probably a gap of sorts between how the teams themselves perceive abstractions and how we would see it. So, for example, neighbourhood officers typically tend to look at this and think that anything that takes them away from what their planned activity was for that day is an abstraction. But for example, we may see a neighbourhood team, for example, doing a fast time drug search or something in there as being absolutely core part of that role, or delivering against an event or public safety issue in their area as well. There's some of that around how we monitor this that we need to tidy up and to be able to present the most accurate picture around this. But I wouldn't in any way seek to downplay the fact that this is a really significant, if not potentially critical issue for us as an organisation going forward. There will be a forthcoming inspection report by Criminal Justice Northern Ireland that will specifically look at this issue and will put a spotlight onto it. That inspection was of community safety and local policing arrangements. We're currently doing the factual accuracy response to that, but it is very clear that that is the key issue. It goes back to how the Chief opened today. This is largely circumstances being driven through the budget situation. It's directly linked to the overall headcount of the organisation, and it's further compounded with the pressures that we have around overtime. And that is basically forcing us to use our neighbourhood policing teams far more than we would like as an auxiliary function to be able to support the frontline policing model, the likes of custody, inquiry offices and other duties, because we simply don't have the numbers of people that we should have. Despite that fact, I'm still somewhere in the region of about £2 million overspent within local policing. That's partly down to some of the surge activity that we've had to do throughout the course of the year in response to, for example, terrorist attacks on our colleagues, or some of the major events and other issues that we've had to try and police and deal with. The key risk, and we identified this before, is that we run the risk of ending up with neighbourhood policing in name only. And I know the Chief has already made it very clear that he's not prepared to accept that. So this will all feed into the considerations that we have around whatever our 24-25 budget looks like. And it's absolutely clear that we're going to have to make some really difficult, but absolutely key choices. And I've no doubt the board will be looking to explore with us what that's going to look like for neighbourhood policing. And again, as the Chief said, we may well require your support in terms of doing what needs to be done in order to protect this key element of our policing service.
Thanks, Chair. Gents, I appreciate the answers. I suppose I have 2 takeaways from that. One is there clearly needs to be better communication with neighbourhood officers to ensure that when they're taken away for things that you consider to be still neighbourhood policing, that they agree that that's the case. and they understand the importance of those other aspects of their job. And the only commitment I'm seeking from you, Chief, is that the levels and the wider impact of abstraction will be monitored. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. A quick supplemental from Trevor,
Yeah.
and quick is the operative word, I'm afraid.
Chair, or sorry, Chief, I somewhat actually find that response contradictory compared to your report. Because in your report, you said undoubtedly we will lose officers from neighbourhood, response and neighbourhood to place uniform resources in contact management centres. So how does that sit with the response you've had in terms of trying to prioritise them and keep them in the communities? Now, once I can appreciate what Bob is saying, where you would use them for searches in their own geographical area, but I think that when a stretch in the imagination suggests putting them in the contact management centres would be keeping them within their area. So there's a contradiction between what your report says and what you're actually saying.
So I don't see that contradiction. We cannot, what I'm not saying to you is we're going to keep the numbers in neighbourhood policing. We can't. I mean, we'll have a private session in the board later. I'll go into some more detail on this. We can't do that. We are facing a position now. Everybody understands the history here and the nature of the threat. No better than this organisation because of the threat that's faced by officers every day and was evidenced by the attack on John. We have got so many responsibilities with regards to our policing services. The operating model is going to change. We will have less people in neighbourhood policing. We will have to move people. We need to answer our 999 calls. But I am committed to neighbourhood policing, but things are going to shrink. There's nothing I can do about that unless we get the funding that we need. I can't ring fence everything that we've currently got in place. I can't. We are going to do a very, precise piece of work. We understand our organisation better than anyone else, or we should do. We will come up with some hard decisions. Then we'll get a bit of help to make sure that those decisions are about right. And we've got to do three things. Firstly, I need to show you why we need 7,000. Currently, it's going to be between 7,200 and 7,500 officers. That's my professional judgment. We need the science to show this board, the Department of Finance, the Department of Justice, that. We then have got to come up with a plan, what we're going to do with the 6,358 with our current abstraction rates around sickness. We've then got to come up with a plan. What are we going to do if we continue to decline into 2025 to below 6,000? Now, the reality is that doesn't mean we'll have the same numbers of police officers in neighbourhood policing. If that's helpful. That's not what you want. It's not what I want. But that's a reality. That's a reality.
Can I just say, I wouldn't miss much time trying to convince us of the science between 7,200 and 7,500, because we have always accepted that as the number. We are not the ones that's driving the number down. But the other thing is actually, maybe you could accept from me that it surely shouldn't always take a uniformed officer to answer a phone in terms of emergency calls either.
No, I do accept that. I mean, I've visited the contact centre. We've got a number of officers who are on, because of different issues they've got on restricted duties who are doing work in the contact centre. But I absolutely accept that, Trevor.
Okay. Okay, I'm gonna move the questions on if that's okay, folks. Linda, on retention of police officers. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to Chief Constable. You've said that it's your firm intention to stop the decline in terms of the officers leaving PSNI. Now you've touched on this earlier, so I know you have kind of, as they already addressed it slightly, but just what are your plans? I know obviously pay is one part of it, and it is a big part of it. We can't underestimate that, I don't believe. But what other plans do you have in place in order to ensure that we do retain the officers that we have that have the experience, and that you want to retain that experience, but also that they don't leave because of things that could have been preventable?
So I think we've touched on a number of these today, but looking at the cultural audit, this sense of fear of doing their job if they can't afford to make a mistake. So that's not helpful on a number of factors, actually, because that means if they do make a mistake, they're less likely to put their hand up about that mistake. And we need to know about those mistakes so we can recover situations. So by having an organisation that and I've made more mistakes than anybody. We make mistakes, we're human beings. That's what happens. Life's about learning. by reassuring them that they can make mistakes and they will be dealt with proportionally and sensibly. And there won't be this punitive approach to that we've possibly seen, not just here, but across policing. Not everything is gross misconduct. There's a fear almost of supervisors dealing with things locally. And by the way, that doesn't mean in any way, I don't know if this goes to Gerry's point, but we're not dropping standards. We won't accept unacceptable behaviours. That's a completely different thing. So by doing that, I think, and listening to the staff, that's not me sitting in meetings with the top team, that's listening to staff on the front line, that'll make a huge difference. I actually think the confidence of all officers in the organisation supporting them more generally is also a big thing. That's the second and important thing, that they feel valued. So we actually thank them for what they do. So I had a conversation with Pamela this morning about what 2024 looks like with regards to long service and good conduct ceremonies that their families can come to. What are we doing around award ceremonies to thank people for bravery, acknowledging what they do that goes beyond, and talking about getting sponsorship for those events, because money's difficult, but we've got big contracts with people. Well, they can help our organisational sort of feel-good factor by helping reward those people by having these events. The big one, though, is pay. That they know that colleagues in England and Wales are getting this, have had the 7% pay award. The officers that start, and this was a visit I did last week, they start on broadly £23,000. Harbour Police are recruiting, and I think it's 30,189. Some of these differences, people will make choices, and they won't be favourable choices to us. They want to be police officers. They want a career in policing. This is vocational. But we're forcing them out of the marketplace. So this 7% will be the biggest thing. It will show them that we believe in them. It will show them that they're being paid a fair wage for the challenging job they do. These are professional people. That's the biggest thing. And even actually speaking up here in support of them, talking about what they do, going and seeing them and listening to them when they're a bit frustrated about what it feels like. Actually be stuck at a hospital, which on Saturday I was given a story for 9 hours. And they're listening to officers going to all the calls that they can't go to put things in place to address that. So I think there are a raft of measures. What I will say, and I think this board does get it. I think you understand all of this. I think, the Department of Justice, Department of Finance have got real competing issues, and I think they understand the arguments. But at the moment, they're saying there's just no money. And I'm saying we've got to, and we need to do more lobbying, more widely than just within the bubble of Northern Ireland about this. And officers get to hear that. That helps. That helps. So I think, there's a list of things we can do. And I'm already feeling a sense of some shift towards how people feel. But words are great. Words are brilliant, and they like words, but they want to see some action. And that's what we've got to do. And that includes around the blame culture. We've actually got to show them that there's a difference. Okay.
Thank you. And I agree with you. One of the other issues that some officers have raised with me is that you get, I suppose, you're in terms of the recognition of what you do in your day's work, it's about what you do, not what sometimes you don't do. And sometimes what you don't do is every bit as valuable, particularly when it comes to working with a community. So I think that maybe if there was a way of finding to recognise those that don't actually do what might count on the stats, I think that there needs to be something looked at around that.
Yeah, the personal stories are so important. So honestly, I get that. I'm conscious of time, but that is something. And having these, community awards, getting stuff done that maybe hasn't been done before and getting sponsored. Because also, can I just tell you, it brings the communities together. So having community awards where you've got people from all the different communities that suddenly meet each other in a positive environment where there's a positive narrative because they're all supported. Muslim communities provide more in the charitable sector than any other community. That's a fact. But people don't realise that. The food bank that the Muslim community were trying to provide, that was the backdrop to the conversation we had in the earlier questions. So getting some of this stuff actually embedded, changing some attitudes is is important for all of us, not just the PSNI.
Thank you. I think we'll be coming back to some of the pay issues in a little while as well. But I'm going to go to Brendan as a question flowing from the recent IRC report.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chief Constable, for your report. And I think at the outset, could I just commend your officers for the successes that are recorded in that report, particularly in relation to your actions in tackling organised crime in Northern Ireland. I think it's important to do that. As the Chair says, I wanted to refer to the Independent Reporting Commission's report for 2023. And again, important to acknowledge that it commends the work of the PSNI Paramilitary Crime Task Force and neighbourhood policing, which it states is having an impact on these groups. However, it also states that much more work requires to be done. And in that regard, in your organised crime report in the last 6 months, there were 65 actions against paramilitaries, but 52 of them were minor actions and 13 moderate. There were no actions that had any major impact. So I was wondering, do you believe that you're adequately using all the tools that you have in terms of tackling paramilitary organisations and having a major impact on them? I'm particularly referring to things like unexplained wealth orders, account freezing orders. I noticed in the report, I think there were maybe 2 of those instruments used against paramilitaries, but the Economic Crime Unit had 23 of those used against other organised crime groups. So my question is, why are we not using them more against paramilitaries? And what assurance can you give us that you would expect more impactful action against paramilitaries in the year ahead?
So firstly, just to thank you for the comments about the task force work who I visited last week and are doing some exceptional work. And I met colleagues actually of Graham's staff, the NCA there, Magistrates Revenue and Customs who are working there. I actually asked the questions that you're probably asking now, I'm asking about, are we exploiting all of the levers that are available to us to deal with these groups? And I have to say, Graham's staff have been very helpful in lowering some of the thresholds, because it's quite interesting. A lot of these groups, the people who are seen as the figureheads of these groups, there's no obvious wealth with the groups. You don't see the, the impressive lifestyle that you might see with organised crime leaders in GB. There is a case going through at the moment, I'll be careful what I say because I'm in the public session, where it's been incredibly difficult legally to progress it. That's an unexplained wealth order that comes within this category. So the information is there is wealth all over the world, but the individual lives a very, very, very ordinary lifestyle. So it's a different foe. It really is a different foe. But because we've lowered thresholds, which allow us to use some of the skills that the National Crime Agency give us, we are, as far as I can see, using all the tactics we can. Although, and I'm not going to talk about it in this public session, we then had a open and frank discussion last Friday about what other things I thought we could be doing. Okay, so I have to be limited in what I say, but just to reassure you, again, mainly because of most of my background in policing, nothing's ever off the table. There's no limits to the imagination. There are things I think we can do that possibly we're not doing. I use the term lawfully audacious in how we deal with these groups, but that's going to take a bit of time. And there is a real challenge to these groups because they're so embedded in the community that to penetrate them, to do some of the work we'd like to do is really, really difficult. But I'll sort of hand over to Mark. So I know Mark would probably want to talk a little bit about some more sophisticated. Then just before we go, before I finish, you did talk about the sort of disruption element and the minor and the moderate and the major. One of the things about the major disruption for me is you get rid of them. So we haven't got rid of them, but that's always the aim. That's the aspiration. Or you put them in prison for a long time. So I think there'll be a narrative for each of those, minor, moderate, and I got that, by the way, last Friday, but I can't remember it now for you. Mark will help with that, but I think that's the challenge. That's where we want to be. That's where we want the figures, but that means putting them away. Okay, Mark.
Thanks, Chief. Thanks, Brendan. So yes, I mean, I think let's just reflect for a second on out of the 84 disruptions in the last 6 months, 7 months from April to November. So it's probably a slightly different reporting period from the IRC. I've looked at 2 were major, 14 moderate, 68 minor by the Paramilitary Crime Task Force. We are moving on to the ATMOS system that we've discussed here and in Performance Committee before, which tends to look more at harm, the harm caused or relieved, rather than this major, moderate, minor. And that's fine, but it still has the same outcome that we are trying to disrupt and dismantle these organised crime groups, and particularly the paramilitary crime groups. Of the organised crime groups that we look at across Northern Ireland, 39% are of the work that we undertake are related to paramilitary crime. The Chief has talked a bit here today about the lowering of thresholds for things like unexplained wealth orders. We've worked very closely with the NCA around that. They still, and because of the lack of that lifestyle, we had a recent meeting where we decided to possibly, with the effort and the legal effort and proportionality that goes into that, that may not be the vehicle. And looking at what other things like asset freezing that we can do. In that 7 month reporting period, there's been 48 persons arrested, 111 searches, over £900,000 in street value of drugs seized, and £117,000 of cash seized. And that sits within the wider, that's an entire seizure in that period from April to October this year of £9 million street value of drugs taken off the streets. So we look at the threat right across the board. Through UpConnexus, which is started in Antrim and is now rolled out across 6 sites across Northern Ireland. This is particularly focusing on those organised crime groups or paramilitary groups because of their disproportionate grip on local communities. And that's about ensuring that there's a connection between the organised crime branch and what we're doing locally in local policing. And through that, we're seeing a lot more of that minor disruption, which is basically a war of attrition, if you like, in constantly disrupting their local ability to deal drugs, to cause harm in those communities. And in July this year, local policing in South Belfast seized cannabis worth an estimated street value of £1.5 million. And that just shows you about taking it off at street level as well to disrupt those paramilitaries, whilst we continue to look at how else we can disrupt them. We have had one unexplained wealth order being progressed. We have a number of account freezing orders. We have been looking at other ways to tackle their finances. We had a review of the Paramilitary Crime Task Force as a ROCU, so a regional organised crime unit, as it would be in England and Wales. We had MPCC leading that, Chief Constable Steve Jupp. His team came over in February this year and reviewed how we were working. There were a number of recommendations out of that, including putting the finance up front in the investigation, and we've undertaken that with colleagues in HMRC and the NCA. Beyond that, it was a very positive report, and any of the recommendations have been taken forward with us and our partners. And we'll probably come on to it later on around the type of drug use. But we are also really targeting now the postal system and the different types of the way people are dealing drugs through social media. But in terms of the paramilitary group, this all sits within the Tackling Paramilitary Programme. This is all about pursue. Actually, the other P's, the prevent, the protect, that is, whilst we support that, and particularly in Bobby's world, work tirelessly towards that, that is where the answer to undoing the grip of paramilitary groups in local communities sit.
Okay, thank you. We've got an extension question from Nuala on this area.
Thank you, Chair. It seems to me that if there's unexplained wealth, then it is more than likely not in this instance criminal behaviour, and that whilst the threshold should be dropped, and I recognise that there was a starting point to introduce it here in Northern Ireland, it's that perhaps it might come to a point where it's up to the courts to decide. So should the threshold actually, would you agree that perhaps getting rid of the threshold in its entirety might be more beneficial? And I understand that the NCA, it's roughly, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's around 4 to 5 people that sit under the PCTF. How is that reflective, and does it fit in with the numbers that the PSNI are actually dedicated to the PCTF? I mean, is it enough and sufficient in order to actually progress the work compared to the level that actually falls on the PSNI to deal with this issue? And in the Chancellor's budget, he also stated that 3 million was given to tackling paramilitary activity. So I just want to ask what engagement that you have had, Mark, or the Chief Constable, with the Department of Finance, DOJ and TEO to ensure that the majority of that money goes to PCTF and not things that do not essentially have targeted outcomes and we can't measure it.
I'm thinking that's one for you, Graham.
Yeah, I can cover some of that and Mark will pick up others. So on the threshold point, your first point, so there's 2 types of threshold. There's a legal threshold for when we can use a power. So for unexplained wealth orders, that in law is £50,000 and we can't go below that. That's just what it is. So that's kind of not up for discussion at the moment. And frankly, I don't think needs to be. What we've been talking about in thresholds, and we discussed with Brendan when he was over in London, was that our own internal threshold for when we would do an asset recovery investigation, which we set fairly high. We don't publicise, but we set relatively high in the rest of the UK. But we have consciously said we will go after things that are of smaller value here because it can have real benefit in Northern Ireland. So that's the 2 different types of threshold, which is your first point. The 3 million, I think, mostly is from PSNI, so I'll leave that to Mark. In terms of our contribution into the Paramilitary Crime Task Force, that comes in 2 ways: people that we actually sit in the Paramilitary Crime Task Force, and then the people that we have doing civil recovery work, which supports the Paramilitary Crime Task Force, who also, as it happens, sit in Belfast, but just in a separate team. So between the 2 of those, I think we've got a really good kind of impact and balance in the team. As I count it up, I think we have 9 current kind of civil recovery investigations that are running, some of which are overt now, some of which haven't yet gone to court, and then some others that are in a more emergent phase. I'll have to check them out. We're using definitions in exactly the same way, but actually it's a sizable chunk and it's more than we had previously.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to, Nuala, do you want to come back on this? And Mark, did you want to come in on this? Yes.
So the total investment in PCTF is 5 million. And yes, I think when we talked about the resourcing, you mentioned the resourcing earlier on. I do believe that there's a difference between the staff of NCA who are embedded within the PCTF teams and the access to the capabilities and the capacity within PCTF, particularly when it comes to international to intelligence systems and international liaison. And as we talked about here before, in almost any organised crime scenario now, you don't go very far back in the chain before you're into an international dimension to that. And that's where our partnership with NCA is particularly valuable.
You made representations regarding the 3 million that was announced by the Chancellor.
We are continually making representations, particularly around through the Tackling Paramilitary Programme Board around funding into the PCTF and to the department around the wider OCTF part of it.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask Edgar to ask another colleague's question.
Yeah. First of all, thanks very much for your report,
related to this,
Chief Constable. Very much endorse your comments about recognising the good work that's done. Any of our board members who have participated in these award ceremonies, I think, have been universally impressed by the courage and commitment of officers, and we would hope that type of good work could be celebrated because it was so easily lost in the minstrel. This is a question from Frank McManus. Frank is in Australia and joined us on Zoom
for an earlier part of the meeting. He'll join us again, but we don't do Zoom in the public session. And he has addressed this to both yourself and to the Director General. So his question is, while we are all encouraged by the news you share with us regarding drug seizures, can you first of all share with us the percentage of the drug market you feel you're stopping month on month? And simply put, are you winning the war on drug supply in Northern Ireland? That's Frank's question.
Yeah, and when Frank comes back from Australia, I want him to come out with, because there was a drug question at the last board that Frank asked, and I think I was out last week with his serious organised crime team, and it was really enlightening and reassuring. And also, it's good for the staff to get visits from members of the board. It's a good thing. It shows them that people like the board, value their work. And it's quite an educational. So I want to invite Frank to come out with the team and see what they're doing. So there's lots of data here. And I will bring Mark in as well as obviously Graham. And it's a difficult thing. We have got a control strategy. Control strategy drives your business. Your control strategy shows your strategic priorities in policing. The serious and organised crime branch have got a control strategy, and drugs is a priority. So that drives the business. Okay, and people, I think, know my view on drugs markets and how drugs are used to manipulate vulnerable people and exploit communities. And we need to throw the kitchen sink at these markets, which hasn't happened all the time in policing. When we've had cuts in policing before, by the way, drug squads have been taken out as well. And we've had a different approach, a softer approach to drugs. I'm not somebody who has a soft approach towards drugs. The successes that we're having are significant. And I think they reflect the fact that the PSNI are, as far as we ever can, because this has been around since I joined the police in 1983, 1984, we are making a significant impact on drugs in Northern Ireland, the drugs market in Northern Ireland. I actually had a meeting with Drew Harris on Monday, and we're looking at, because if something happens in Dublin, it will be felt in Belfast, it will be felt, around the island of Ireland. We need to have a more joined up approach around drugs. So we're going to have quarterly meetings and refresh a strategy from a number of years ago, and I want drugs to be a key limb of that work moving forward. So we have had 2006, 2007. Since then, round about 2.5 times more drug seizures occur. Mark talked about some figures earlier. In 7 months of this year, we recovered £9.4 million worth of drugs. The previous 12-month period, it was 9.2 million. I just looked at, this is from my visit last week, at some of the data they showed me. In June, we recovered £100,000 worth of cocaine through the PCTF. In July, there was £1.5 million worth of cannabis seized through local neighbourhood policing. And in August, just the summer months, there was another £1 million worth of cocaine recovered at Marnport with the Border Force. This is and I only give those examples because they provide the variety of involvement across the organisation. What we do accept, though, drugs is a whole systems approach. It needs to be part of the strategic framework with health. We are only one element of tackling the fight against drugs. Now, I'm going to hand over to Mark for some more of the detail with regards to why I would say we're successful in this space. But one of the things that we can do, and I hope I'm not going to get told off by Graham, he might kick me under the table, but Graham can talk about this with far more elegance than I. There's some work around wastewater analysis that has been done in GB, hasn't been done here yet, that gives you a sense, and it's not quick pieces of work, which gives you a sense of what the drug intake is in society. That's the sort of work that we need to be done here to understand actually what the market looks like. The strategic assessment will give us some view. And by the way, markets affect things. So how successfully or not, and there certainly has been some work done by the Taliban with regards to the opium trade. That has an effect on drugs here. We are actually seeing drugs now come from, like cocaine, come from America, where you wouldn't normally see, because this is a bit of an old world. So there's lots to play into this. But the statistics, the performance shows above other forces in the UK, we are more successful in tackling drugs than other police forces. So that's the good news story. Let me hand you over though to Mark, if I may, and then we'll come to Graham.
Thanks, Chief. So the Chief has talked about the overall sort of seizures. By far, still the drugs type that we see being imported into Northern Ireland is cannabis, cannabis resin or cannabis. We have carried out a lot of analysis. I agree with the Chief. We have managed to secure funding from the DOJ to carry out wastewater analysis, but that's a one-time offer to find a baseline, whereas it's a very useful tool. And as Chief says, Graham can talk about that in more detail. We see an all-Ireland and all-island sort of network of distribution from OCGs. We work very closely with the guards. We earlier this year signed a memorandum of understanding and an information sharing agreement again with the guards for that flow of intelligence. And we conduct a lot of joint operations, particularly with UK Border Force, and things like Op Fusion, which you will see targeting criminal elements within the haulage industry. And that has proved a real success. We're seeing higher volumes being seized. We are seeing ever more complex hides within vehicles, and we're managing to break that down and have real success at the ports and with Op Fusion around that. The other big, so we're seizing more, we're arresting more, we're disrupting more than ever before. Our big challenge here as well, and the Chief mentioned the public health approach, is polydrug use. Most of it is coming through fast parcel service, through the postal service. People are ordering prescription type pills, illegal or illicit prescription drugs online. We think they're coming in at around £1 per pill. And that is by far and away where we see the sort of lifestyle around that and that type of drug use in our drug deaths. So that is a whole other part of that whole system health-led approach. We have had more success of late using powers with the UK Border Force in intercepting some of those postal deliveries. These drugs are coming from various parts of the world, including the US, and there's a business model there that allows for a certain amount of that to be intercepted. So we are fighting against that in particular, and that is where we see the biggest opportunity for a whole systems health-led approach. The one other type that has been mentioned here before is nitrazine, and again a concern for Garda Síochána and ourselves. We proactively analyse what we discover post drugs deaths, and we are not seeing that as a major issue in Northern Ireland at this point. And I think lastly, just to say, we have started to progress some work with colleagues in the NCA and the MPCC level and Garda Síochána around what does the movement in organised criminality north, south and east, west actually look like, to try and get a better understanding of that. And that might take us some way to answering Frank's question, which was what percentage are we actually stopping, because at the minute we don't.
So it's a really good question from Australia, from Frank, and we ask it across all the threats that we look at. Kind of, are we winning? And it is sometimes really quite hard to know. So, and what percentage of the drugs are we stopping? Actually, the only way of having an accurate understanding of the percentage of drugs you're stopping is knowing how much drugs are consumed. The only accurate way of knowing how the quantity of drugs being consumed is through wastewater analysis, which the Chief mentioned a second ago. which actually was pioneered in Australia. So Frank can do a bit of research when he's when he's out there. We are doing that in England and Wales, and also starting to do it in Scotland. It is not yet happening in Northern Ireland. And I think it would be a really good thing to start happening here. That should be further discussions. You may want to support it as a board, but with DOJ, which can give you really quite accurate assessments of the quantities of drugs being consumed and of different types of drugs, not cannabis as it happens, but most others in a country. Then we can tell what proportion we are intercepting. What we do know from lots of other analysis and surveys is that drug consumption in the UK is higher than the European average, particularly on cocaine. It is also higher in Northern Ireland than in England, but lower than in Scotland, as I mentioned at the last board. We have issues across the UK, but definitely here with polydrug use, which is just more dangerous for people. I really would like to come on to nitazines and synthetic opioids more when we get into kind of my part of the session, because I do think it is a big challenge. We have been seizing more, we have been arresting more. The difficulty for us to know is whether that is because we have got better at our jobs or because there is just more coming in. And it's probably a bit of both, but it's quite hard to unpick that. So the 3 points to leave you with, it's quite hard to answer that question. It would really help if we did wastewater analysis, and we should have a proper think about that, or you should as a board, and think about how we could push that forward. And as John said as well, the answer on this is as much public health. I mean, I'm hard on drugs too. We absolutely want to be arresting people and intercepting the drugs. But unless we can wean people off the drugs, the demand will still be there, the profit will still be there, and so the supply will still come. It's always been quite resilient, drug supply. So we have to make sure we're investing in healthcare and rehabilitation for people too. That's it.
I wanted a quick supplemental on this, and I'm just conscious of 4 more questions here for people.
Just very briefly, because as Graham said, we're going to his session. I wanted to welcome the report on drugs, because I don't think the enormity of what is being lifted, in other words, the good story is really out there. But I also wanted just to make a comment on the question of Frank raises, because people raise it all the time, and it's, are we running against drugs? And in my opinion, not to oversimplify it, if we're getting it, we're running. You know, of course we can do better and we'll get more, but it's sort of a trick question to me. But are we, if you give a report like that, then in my opinion, we're running. You know, if of course we get rid of all drugs, but that ain't happening. But every drug you lift is and you talk about health, because it isn't just policing, has an impact in society. So it's just to say it.
Okay, thank you. I have different questions from Kate, Mark and Mike, but before that I'm going to go back to Trevor on funding and on pay rise. Just, I know you've talked about it before.
Yeah,
just you wanted to highlight a particular thing.
I suppose, I mean, obviously I welcome, and I'm sure everyone welcomes your comments. Please welcome your comments in terms of the 7% pay rise and getting that delivered. We'll see in some of your correspondence with the Secretary of State, and clearly that seems to be falling in deaf ears. So there is a danger in terms of that expectation of officers of getting the rise and actually delivering it. So where do you actually see that? Because I mean, you have made big promises, and I mean, obviously it's not your gift or our gift to deliver that. So where do you see that falling out, or when do you anticipate that we'll see something positive in relation to that? That's the first part.
So it's really hard. What I say to the staff is I believe they should have that 7% pay rise. I don't want to overpromise and underdeliver. I make that very clear. If I could give it you tomorrow, I'd give it you. But I'm told there's not the money to give it you. So I've had the conversation now, we've got to find out how we pay it, not that we're not going to pay it. So I'm very honest with them. You know, even, and you know, I'm now an accounting officer. I had a day's course on it, but I've been in the police for around about 40 years. So I know where I feel my responsibilities as an accounting officer are very important. I need to explain how every pound note is spent for the PSNI. I need to know how it's spent, where it's spent, why it's spent, so I can demonstrate my due diligence around my accounting officer responsibilities to anybody, including this board, the Department of Finance and the Department of Justice. But because of the conversations we've had today and the threats that are in Northern Ireland, and that Northern Ireland has a unique policing context, which has been amplified today repeatedly. We can't go below these numbers. We are losing police officers because they can't afford to be police officers. So this is for political parties here, the executive here, it's for the Treasury, it's for the Home Secretary, it's for the Prime Minister, it's for everybody, for us to make this case so that something might shift what is at the moment a logjam. So I'm very honest with them, Trevor. You know, and if it comes to a point where I have to step into a position where I am breaching my accounting officer responsibilities, and the board and the Department of Justice and the Department of Finance decide that they may have to sanction me, then we'll get into that territory if we need to. So that's the way this is going. Okay.
That's very interesting. So given they've been waiting so long, why not breach it now? Why wait? What are you waiting on? Because you've had your answer from the side of the state. You know all the political parties in Northern Ireland support your position. Indeed, they support the officers with the 7% to bring them in parity with the rest of the UK. Well, that's a very bold statement you've just made. So why not just breach the authority now and actually pay them? Actually, you'd be like Santa Claus coming to Christmas.
Yeah, well, that's why you're the politician to say things like that, and I'm the police chief constable, and I have to make sure this organisation continues and is funded. But well, no, I'm saying that's my intention to do. I'm setting out the way this is going to come forward in the future. That's what I'm doing. I'm not going to be irresponsible. I'm very conscious of the public purse. I'm setting out the reality of the position, and I'm going to set out, if that doesn't result in anything that changes, the next steps. I've done that a little bit in the answer to your last question. So that's the responsible thing to do.
Okay. So, and I support your position, and the sooner you make second, well, I mean, Chair, everyone else have their opportunity.
No, I understand that as well.
Detail it
now.
Yeah. Contact centres. I mean, I see your correspondence relating to that. Now, I could be forgiven for defending the Secretary of State, which I hate to do. But I mean, there's efficiencies always needs to be found within the organisation as well. Or sorry, could be forgiven. Okay, couldn't forgive him. Okay. The contact centres, there's correspondence related to the contact management centres about streamlining from 3 to 1. And I notice again in correspondence that you're delaying a decision on that until the next financial year. Why has that been delayed and continued to be delayed? And why has that not been brought forward as an efficiency?
So you have an advantage because the contact management centre, there were discussions some time ago, I think we're members of the board, but we've not done the work on that. We've got currently 3. There is an obvious challenge of going down to 1 because of business continuity and resilience. We need to do some work as part of the operating model to understand where we can cut costs, including estate. So that work has not been done. That is something that we need to do, and I'm very open to that. But we've had challenges from the board around shrinking and changing our estate around custody. That comes with all sorts of challenges around workforce and where they are working from and when they're going to. That has to have consultation, and that work and those sorts of decisions have not been made. That work, there's no mature work done there. Unless I bring anybody in who wants to contradict that. Pamela? Ryan?
Yeah, thanks, Chief, and thanks, Trevor. And I mean, absolutely, Trevor, it's something that we need to explore. I think the contact centres are very much a frontline service. So you'll know here we answer consistently our 999 calls in line with the SLA in relation to it. So they do a good job around that. They deal with about 50% of calls that come in for demand of the service at source within there. So anything we do in terms of making changes needs to be really well thought through, costed. You'll understand bringing 3 into 2, even in terms of finding the space to do that, there will be potentially quite extensive cost in doing that process. And then in terms of the people impact of moving across, the demand doesn't appear to be reducing. And I really want to understand that when we do that, if we move to that, it's really well thought through, because I don't want to damage what we're delivering at the moment in doing it. But absolutely, we as the Chief has outlined have to look at every opportunity to be able to do things more efficiently, with less cost. But I want to be sure that we're doing that with the right evidence base to do it,
that it's based on good, solid facts as to what we get, what the benefits would be from it.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to Kate, and it's on Pride events.
Thank you, Chief Constable. You've talked about valuing officers and championing diversity. In light of this, do you plan to review the decision made by your predecessor on allowing LGBTQIA+ officers to walk in the Pride Parade in uniform?
So thanks for the question. I've spoken to a number of people about this actually, just in the engagements through the audit, the cultural audit we've done, and it's been raised with me, just so you're aware. What I will say, the backdrop for this for people I'm sure are aware, but previously the PSNI had marched at Pride, and then a decision was taken this year's event that wouldn't happen. That was because Bobby Singleton, Claire and others did some work to make sure that we had a policy around what we do at events, how we engage with events that was consistent for everyone. There is the MPCC lead, Vanessa Jardine. I actually spoke to her about this yesterday. Vanessa, when she was the Deputy Chief Constable of West Midlands, put a letter out to all police forces about Pride events and marching. We have a different context in Northern Ireland with regards to marches. I was at an event with regards to marching on Saturday, with regards to the policing of it, to see how our staff were and how it was being policed. We have to be very alive to that context in Northern Ireland, and we have to apply consistency. So what we've come up with is a policy that takes regard of the legislation that directs these things, what other forces do, and an extremely good presentation has been put together by Bobby and Claire that I know has been shared with the board, and I shared that with Vanessa yesterday. I asked her what her view was on this, and she said clearly there is a Northern Ireland context that you have to take into account. So when the next events occur, whatever events they may be, we will, if you like, run through that policy, that process map to decide what we are going to do. What I will say around staff from any community, that doesn't mean we don't support that community, but far from it. We will engage in those events in any way that we are able to engage in those events. We will support those events in any way that we can support those events, as well as those individuals. These are lived behaviours around fairness and equality. That I can absolutely reassure you. There is a unique context here that often butts up with one view against another. And what I have to do, and I will do as head of this organisation, is make difficult decisions that may suit some and not others. But as long as there is a framework that's fair and transparent, we'll get less criticism than perhaps otherwise. So am I, as an individual, going to review it? No, but the process map will run for every event that we have to police to make sure that there's fairness to everybody. But I should bring in Bobby and Claire, who've done the work, if they want to add to that. I don't know. Bobby or no? Claire? Okay. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm going to move to Mark on the question on road safety.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to the Chief Constable and team. Sadly, this year we've seen an increase in the number of lives lost in our road, and consequently the number of families devastated and the number of communities shocked and rocked. At the same time, we're seeing a record number of motorists being detected speeding, and presumably an increase in the amount of revenue being generated through fines. In that regard, and I understand that this money must be reinvested in improving road safety, but could I just ask what work is being done with partners in the Road Safety Partnership, DFI, other emergency services and the community to ensure that we're maximising the benefit of that spend in terms of reducing the number of people being killed and seriously injured on our roads?
So thank you for the question, Mark. So obviously, in recent months, I have seen some tragic incidents with regards to road traffic accidents, particularly young people, particularly distraction, it seems, when these things have been looked at, being distracted from driving. And there are the sort of 5 key areas that we're trying to focus on to reduce killed and seriously injured sort of statistics. And I think this is, by the way, this was another conversation with Drew Harris on Monday that we're both seeing around the statistics. The Northern Ireland Road Safety Partnership obviously manage these issues. That's a combination. We're at the table. Also at the table are the Court Service and Department for Infrastructure. Decisions are taken there about the allocation of funds. We had a conversation actually this morning about what more can we do that we're not doing. I was at National Police Chiefs Council yesterday and got a huge amount of learning. In fact, I was there with Graham yesterday talking about various things on the national sort of policing stage. I think there might be some lessons that we could learn from others around that. But we're open to any ideas around this. I mean, I'll bring in Ryan. Oh, sorry, Chris was going to deal with it. I'll bring in Chris to talk about this a little bit more. But the chair of the England Roads Partnership, I've found his details to potentially just ask him to come and look if there's anything more that we could be doing here that we're not currently doing. But it's something that, you know, the number of deaths, one death is too many, but we need to do more in this space, I think. Chris?
Thank you, Chief. Thank you, Mark. Yes, so you'd be aware we spoke before about the strategy from a police service perspective, which focuses on those fatal 5 that the Chief alluded to there, which is speeding, drinks and drugs, use while driving, lack of the use of seatbelts, use of phones and other mobile devices, and general inattention. Those are the 5 key areas. So the strategy focuses on those. And then with the Northern Ireland Road Safety Partnership, we also focus on those areas together collectively, because this is a shared endeavour, whether it's the infrastructure and the street furniture and the support we get from the DFI in respect to those issues, or the enforcement across those areas, which is very much a policing responsibility. What's really important to support all of that is clarity around how we do spend the money with that partnership. And I know we've spoken this on previous occasions. In the past, it's not always been as clear, but I'm pleased to say through some positive engagement and support from the Department of Justice, as recently as September, we did get a clear direction. And as a result of that, we do have an agreed expenditure plan going forward now with the Road Safety Partnership. So the priorities at the moment from the partnership, focusing on camera maintenance and calibration, purchase and implementation of new cameras, a public education program on careless driving, which is one of those fatal 5. Obviously the speeding is one around the cameras is the other. The careless driving campaign is around that inattention. The recruitment of additional staff into our fixed penalty processing centre. So as you say, increased enforcement around camera activity leads to increased demand. We've also recently introduced fixed penalty notices around careless driving. So again, focusing on a different one of those fatal 5 within that processing centre. So it's not all about speeding, it's all about other offences as well. But that increases demand and it needs to be met. So we're getting some money from the partnership there to support that. We're exploring new opportunities as well with the partnership. So one of those other fatal 5 I talked about was the use of drugs, and we're exploring, and I think we've mentioned it at the board previously, the opportunities to have roadside tests to identify people who are driving under the influence of drugs. That comes with increased demand as well, because we don't currently do that. So we need to have the support around the partnership to deal with all of that. And there's further work going on around the possibility of delivering education programs to young and vulnerable drivers, which will be really important. So that's a work in progress, but something, again, that the partnership is supporting.
Thank you, Chris. And my concern is that there's a lot more emphasis on enforcement than education, and both have equally important roles to play in terms of driving down road deaths. We don't want to just see more money being ploughed in the purchase and maintenance of ever more sophisticated enforcement equipment to generate more income, unless that's being spent in a meaningful and impactful way. And it would it's no one agency's a responsibility, and it's certainly no one agency's fault. But I would like to see more emphasis, I suppose, across those partners. I know you're just one of the partners at the table, but when DFA, for example, we know all about budgetary difficulties in the PSNI do, but when DFA have had their budget completely obliterated in terms of public information and education, I think there's scope for wiser use of the money.
Thanks, Mark, and I'll give you that assurance, and thank you for your support. I know that you are very supported in this area. I'll give you that assurance that as a result of this new plan around the expenditure, we'll make sure that we commit more to education to address those issues.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And the last question to Mike with a supplement from Joanne is on the engaging the protesters outside.
Thank you. I was wondering, John, if you were able to take the opportunity to engage with the protesters who were outside when you arrived. I would characterize them as relatively small group, but perhaps not unrepresentative of officers who've been traumatized in the line of duty and have also been deeply distressed by their subsequent treatment, which takes me to a hobby horse, which is how we process injury on duty and ill health retirement applications. As you know, they come in the first instance here to the board, and it would be my argument, as members know, that we shouldn't be doing this, which is not a criticism of the staff, but a reflection, I think, of the fact that our roles primarily are to be the employer of senior officers and staff and to hold the police to account and scrutinise your work. I don't think we should be a service or programme delivery board. And I looked to the judgment recently from Justice Schofield, who said that we do not have either the qualifications or the experience to challenge medical determinations, and yet we have a statutory duty to be the final decision maker. And that seems to me to be illogical to the point of bonkers. So I wonder, could we come together and try to lobby for the legislative change, which would bring in a well-resourced, effective, efficient regime, which means those people don't have to stand out there on a cold, wet day in the mouth of Christmas.
Thank you.
So thank you for the question. I did go and speak to them to say hello. I got a sense they didn't want to speak to me, but we've had a couple of letters, and I think that's one of the group that came into me. I'll confirm that for you, Mike, but I'm pretty sure they're one of the groups have written to me, not expecting to see me. And I've said to the office, I will meet them. So I'm meeting, I think it's them and another group of retired officers. I'm almost certain I'm right. This is one of the two groups that often write asking for meetings and they don't meet the chief, but I'm going to go and meet them. So I understand, look, the issues and the service they've given. So I'll go and listen to what they've got to say. I can't profess to know all the detail of what they are out there for. The ill health pension issue, you know, I've spoken to individual board members around this. 25% of our circa 700 police officers who are sick, 25% are in that queue with regards to getting the sign off their ill health pensions. So that's 25% of wages that we're paying that I could use for recruits and get new people in. And if you stop feeding an organisation, if you stop recruiting an organisation, the consequences are dire, not just because of the operational context, but also people moving through the organisation, promotions in the organisation. It has a really negative impact on an organisation. You constantly need new people, new ideas. I'm up for any discussion, as I've made clear, about how we clear that backlog. I've met the team actually doing a great job here, the people the board have employed who are working tirelessly but can't actually keep up with the pace each month. So I very much welcome any discussion about how we might clear that. But I very much think I should ask Pamela or Claire if they'd like to add to that.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks, Mike, for the question. I think just to acknowledge, we're, like you, acutely aware. We don't ever want any officer serving or retired to find themselves in the position where they're having to resort to protesting about something that to this degree. There are two aspects here. One is around the injury on duty scheme, and you'll be aware that that scheme is under review, being led by the Department of Justice. Not only the provisions of the scheme, but also how and who administers that scheme and the roles and responsibilities that sit between the board and PSNI. And I understand that consultation on the aspects of the scheme are due to be out for public consultation early in 2024. So there's the aspect of the reform needed around the injury on duty scheme, and we're part of a working group, I think, as are the board and represented on that. And then, of course, there's the IHR process, which is quite often goes hand in hand for many officers. And as you've heard from me in Resources Committee and in other board meetings, we're investing heavily at the early part of our officers' careers now to try to avoid the circumstances in future years where somebody does get to the point where they have to leave on ill health retirement because of the experiences, risk or harm that they have faced as a police officer. So how do we build a resilient workforce? How do we do post-incident debriefing, and how do we equip and support with clinical and other developmental interventions so that we can try and reduce that happening in the future for the next generation of our workforce.
Okay, thank you. Is that okay? Thank you. And Joanne, you wanted to?
Thanks, Chair. Kind of follows on from this. Claire, I want to thank you for your letter that you sent after my questions at the last board meeting. And I think that it ties in nicely with this, because I think that before people reach the point of the Blue Light Association, who were outside today, and I want to commend them for the work that they do for their retired colleagues and for serving colleagues to try and help them through in circumstances where the PSNI isn't able to provide support. It seems to me there's a point in between, and that's the point at which people flag up, I'm in trouble, I'm in mental difficulty, to the point where they have to leave and live with the consequences of the psychological trauma that they have faced. When I look at your letter, in terms of the mental health treatment services, there are 81 people on a waiting list, an 8-month waiting list for employee support. There are 131 people on a 5-month waiting list for CBT therapy. There are 94 people on a waiting list for clinical psychology. And again, that waiting list is 8 months. So I don't know to what extent they overlap, but there are 306 people waiting to be seen. And I think that gap could be the difference between somebody being able to continue to work in the organisation in which they take pride and on work in which they take pride, and having to leave in a state of damage and trauma. So I would like to know, Chief, from you, I'm certain that you consider that those delays are unacceptable and unsustainable. And I would like to know from the team, okay, what's going to be done to turn this around, and when can we expect to see a change? Because this can't carry on.
So, yeah, I agree. We've had conversations about the timeframes. There's a lot of things that I suspect, I can't give you evidence of this, will play into the issue. Some of that will be pressures on health. We're obviously providing additional services to try and help our staff, support our staff, but those services aren't being given as timely as we'd like. I've been involved in projects before around physiotherapy, where we've involved people who are going through a training process, so they have to effectively practice on people. So as part of their qualification, we allowed that to happen with police officers, which meant we cleared a bit of a backlog. And I only mention that because I introduced that concept to the team around what's the thinking, what we're not doing that we could do, working with even, I know some work's been done with organisations who provide counselling. They're charitable organisations. If we provided them with some funding, could they help with some of the backlog, even if it's clearing stuff to a point that then we can do sort of business as usual, where the delays would be, more palatable, more acceptable for both the individual and the organisation. So those conversations have been had. And listen, I'm very conscious. One of the reasons I will meet them is because they'll have some ideas. often it's the people who suffer this, they know these issues better and have ideas that, that's why it's important to talk and more important to listen. So anything we can do, we will. I do worry, though, about all of the issues I suppose we've spoken about today. And money is not the solution to everything. It really is. In fact, on occasions, you can, ironically, I think, use money that can have a negative impact on an organisation because you grow in ways you shouldn't grow. But funding will be a key issue with this moving forward, this area of trying to support our officers. And of course, we'll be looking for areas to reduce costs. We're the police, we've got to provide frontline services. So again, it's an area that I worry about, but I'm sure we'll find fixes for, and we're determined to do that. But I'll pass over to Claire around your question, if I may.
Thank you. I probably don't have a satisfactory answer for either me or you on that, Joanne. I agree. We have to try and provide help and support as quickly as possible. The number of referrals to our mental health service, specifically that service, which has a number of different interventions and support mechanisms, but that it has increased by 116% since 2019. So the demand is huge, and obviously, as you've heard, in relation to our financial position, our resources don't match that, so we're not able to meet that demand. Two things that we are doing as alternatives, but again, they're not yet sufficient. One is that we will obviously signpost some of those groups that you've described to our partner organisation, Inspire Wellbeing, who are able to meet some of that demand. But we also know that some of our officers don't want to go to an external organisation for the type of support, and given the nature of some of the issues that they faced. But we do try to signpost those who we have it clinically identified as maybe most in need. And secondly, we are exploring and indeed do use, for example, trainee psychologists to come and support and boost the resources within our psychology team to provide more clinical time. So we haven't yet cracked that, and we're also conscious that is exacerbated too by the waiting times through the health service as well. So it is work that we will continue to try and continuously improve and do better for the people that need that attention and care.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. That's the end of the questions on that session. Director General Graham, my apologies. You can hear the debate around the room and the importance of all the issues. So my apologies for the delay. So we thank you for your report, and it provides a vast amount of information on the work of the agency. But if you'd like to make some introductory remarks, I know there's been questions throughout, but there's a few questions at the end. So over to yourself, Graham.
No, thank you very much, and it's great to be here again. I mean, I might just start by saying that a lot of the discussion that I've heard here is very similar to that we have back in London. So we are the only other law enforcement organisation that hasn't had its pay increase for this year, and all the issues that John raised about how that feels then for the workforce, we share, and they really are. I mean, they are very stark. And it is absolutely the money that people need to get by, but also the feeling of being valued or not being valued that not getting a pay rise gives you. And then the well-being points as well. I mean, there's just an awful lot of recruitment and retention that is the same, and that's something I think we need to make sure we are continuing to do with PSNI, and really in support of the board as well, as making sure you're not just looking at an organisation in isolation, but you can see how retention data, for example, compares with other police forces or other organisations, because there are a lot of things that are happening across all of society, and it's important to look at it in context, I think. Anyway, sorry, slight segue. Really good to be back. It was good as well to have Joanne, who's just disappeared, and Brendan and Janet in London for a kind of visit to the National Crime Agency headquarters and just talk about some of our capabilities there. Pleased to have put before you this for this meeting, a slightly different report to the one that we've done before. So, I mean, it looks and feels different, I think, but also covers 6 months rather than a quarter. So you've got one report since I was last here rather than two. Really welcome some feedback from you on whether that is answering the questions you have. I mean, I'm sure it will raise new questions as well, but the format of the report, does it work for you? One thing that we'll put into future reports that your Human Rights Advisor, John Wadham, has been asking us for is some commentary on human rights and how we make sure we abide by them in our work here or on behalf of Northern Ireland. So we will definitely do that in future reports. Sorry not to be able to do it this time. In terms of what the report says, I mean, it sets out our strategy. I ran through that at the last board meeting, but the two key elements for here being our role in leading the system and making sure we are doing that better, the operational system, on behalf of everyone in law enforcement, and then our own operational activity and making sure that we are focusing that as much as we can on the most harmful organised crime groups affecting the UK, including Northern Ireland, and doing that by going, as we've called it, upstream, overseas and online. That does and is having real impact here in Northern Ireland. So, for example, the big seizure in September that the Garda made just off the coast of Ireland of 2 tons of cocaine was an operation that we had worked with them on and was intelligence that had come out of, I won't go into where the intelligence came from, but intelligence that allowed us to identify and track the boat that was coming. That was cocaine that would have come into the Republic, but absolutely Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK as well. Work that we are doing on litazines, and I'd like to come back in that in questions maybe rather than in introductions, is really important. Work on money laundering, trying to tackle some of the big international groups that are laundering the money that is made throughout the UK, including in Northern Ireland. And we made some real progress and some big arrests and disruptions around that. And another topic that's come up frequently in these discussions around fraud and the total level of fraud. When we look at the macro figures on fraud that is reported by the public, our best data set is actually England and Wales rather than the UK as a whole, but it's probably representative. That feels like it's turned a corner. So the last 3 quarters have shown a downward trend in the total number of fraud. Now, that isn't just NCA activity at all. That has been a cross multi-agency work, and I think that telco companies have done a good job in turning the corner there, but it's beginning to come down. In terms of our report on what's happening, you'll have seen a slight shift, which is what we said we were trying to do, our tilt into focusing more on the major and moderate disruptions and on the most significant groups, and you'll have seen those have grown. And as I suggested would happen, you've also seen a slight reduction in the minor disruptions. So we've been trying to tilt the organisation's effort into the more important investigations and jobs, and that is beginning to happen. I mean, it's just a 1 6-month snapshot, so we need to see it play out for a bit longer before we can be absolutely sure it's a trend. On the individual threats within it, you'll have seen an increase in drugs and guns and a bit of money laundering in the kind of certainly the major disruptions that we have been having. Cyber and fraud, relatively stable. It's actually harder to tie some of our major disruptions to Northern Ireland. I mean, they're for everyone, but for the ones that we can tie to Northern Ireland, relatively stable. Child sexual exploitation, modern slavery and human trafficking have gone down a bit over the last 6 months, as you'll have seen. That said, the disseminations that we've passed on to intelligence disseminations that we've passed on through PSNI are still really high, 181 in the last 6 months period, which have led to 39 arrests and 90 children being safeguarded. So that figure is actually slightly higher than the previous 6 months. You may want to ask me a question on that, because Meta have made an announcement today about end-to-end encryption, which I think is going to see that figure come down in the future, which is really worrying to us. Finally, just in terms of our specific Northern Ireland work, Simon and I talked at the last board about the discussions we'd been having about how we wanted to focus our work, and we picked 3 priorities for NCA and PSNI joint working, and those were to identify and go after high-value targets, whoever they were, but including paramilitaries. Secondly, to make sure we were doing as much as we could around asset recovery, with a particular focus around paramilitaries. We covered a bit of that earlier on. And thirdly, to make sure we were going after fugitives overseas. So people who have been arrested, where there was a charge against them in Northern Ireland, but they've absconded, and how we can go after them overseas. So we've made progress to differing extents on all 3 of those, which I can cover in questions, but it's in the report a bit. Final point, John and I have been reflecting since his appointment And we're not disagreeing with those priorities, but we are going to take stock and just have a foot on the ball moment once John's properly got his feet under the table and just make sure they are right, see if we want to refocus them. So we will look at that again. That's it as introduction.
Okay, thank you, Graham. We have a couple of questions from members. The first question is from Brendan and it's on review of the NCA and PSNI joint working.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you, Graham, for your report, and also thank you for giving up your time personally when we visited you recently. It's very, very helpful. You made reference to it there, Graham. You mentioned a joint commission to review how NCA and PSNI work together. I just was interested, has that work been completed? And I think you're saying it hasn't. I just wondered what sort of the outcomes that are flowing from it.
Sorry, no, I mean that has completed. That was and I thought I mentioned it at the last board, but I may not have done. But that was so that we had those three focuses that I just mentioned. So really making sure we were collectively identifying the highest value targets in or affecting Northern Ireland, making sure we were maximising our asset recovery, civil recovery powers, particularly against paramilitaries, and going after fugitives. So I mean a quick expansion on that. So we have now got three investigations into high value targets, three led by the NCA. There are more from PSNI that we have initiated as a result of that work. I won't go into what they are in the public session, and they will take time because the investigations into high value targets always do. But we have got that focus now and are building an intelligence that helps define those high value targets better. We covered a little bit the civil recovery work against paramilitaries, but we are definitely doing more of that now than we were before. As we discussed in Spring Gardens, we have made sure we've kept our thresholds low on this activity, so we are not missing targets that really matter here that that wouldn't be as important in GB. And thirdly, on fugitives, that will be a push more in 2024. So that's been work with PSNI to make sure that we've got the warrants go through PPS. And can have those that we can work on internationally. We've been pretty successful on doing that, with a particular focus on Spain, because historically that's where a lot of British criminals have kind of fled to. A bit less now, but with Crime Stoppers we've had campaigns there, and we launched one last January with 12 targets from across policing, not just NCA targets. And we've since arrested 7 of those with international partners, not just in Spain, but they had fled to other countries. So we're doing a pretty good job of identifying individuals we want to get and then working with international partners. And over time, because this is difficult work with international partners to try and find where these people have gone, identifying them and extraditing them back to the UK. But I expect we'll launch a kind of series of Northern Ireland related targets in 2024 and hopefully have some success with that.
Thank you. Is that okay, Brendan? Okay, we have a question from Trevor and then John. So Trevor, please.
Well, I suppose first to commend your report. I think it's easier to read, I think, and easier to understand, to be honest. I suppose the question I want to ask, clearly the data breach has been a big thing. Have you played any part in terms of assisting the PSNI in relation to that, or is that affected in terms of relationships between yourselves and the PSNI because of that breach?
I think if anything, it's strengthened relationships just from pure empathy. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing to go through, and the kind of sympathy and support of all of British policing has been with PSNI. Yes, we have provided direct support. We've not been, as key as some other agencies would be in this, but we have capabilities and access around, internet, being able to surf the dark web and spot where information might have been uploaded. We have relationships with tech companies kind of around the world who can kind of support us in trying to chase down leads and take information offline. And we used all of those. As it happens, the information was not spread in those ways, so we didn't have to act to take stuff, but we were in very close touch with PSNI and still are on this through our particularly our cyber team.
Okay, yeah, thank you. John?
Thank you, Chair. Graham, can I add the thanks expressed to you for the report and the detail contained therein? And I'm noting the increase, for example, in the major and moderate disruptions. And the premise to this question has to be, I must point out to you that I want what you do to be properly funded in the way that I want all of the work of the PSNI to be properly funded. So I hope you'll understand the context of this question is the difficult discussion we have just had as a board, not for the first time, about overall police funding. So the question directly is, are you feeling similar pressures from a UK government funding perspective? And if you are, how likely is that to impact the results that we see this year? And how likely do you feel that the pressures in the PSNI funding could impact their contribution to the results and outcomes that we've seen illustrated in the reports this year? And of course, the additional overall context to this question is that all policing is relevant to these figures, because good local policing builds up good relations and flows of information and all sorts of other things. So I hope you know where that's coming from. I'm keen to know the levels of UK government funding, how it's affecting this aspect of policing in relation to the overall policing product and service in Northern Ireland.
So we are definitely facing pressures on funding, but they are not nearly as acute as they are here or in Police Scotland, actually. I think those are the two forces in the UK that are facing far and away the toughest financial challenge. England and Wales policing, we were discussing at Chiefs Council, as John mentioned earlier on, has some really tough decisions to make, and the funding is really tight. It is for the NCA as well. I mean, our funding has increased over a number of years, but from a very low base when we were set up in 2013. The organisations were put together and a massive haircut done, so we're kind of recovering from that. So I think as an organisation, we probably don't have the funding we need to do the task that we are set, and I think we are under-capitalised. We haven't got the investment into the major capabilities we need. But in terms of the acute challenges that John and the team are facing, it is not of the same order that you have here.
Chair, I want to thank you for that answer. I think we as a board should note the impact, perhaps disproportionate impact there may be on two of the devolved regions in terms of UK government funding, and that's perhaps something we as a board may want to explore in more detail.
Thank you, John. Mukesh, and then Nuala.
Thank you, Chair. And I would like to echo the layout of the report, and thank you for that. It's much easier to read. Just a question on public perception. There seems to be a public perception that the drugs trade, if you want to call it that, in Northern Ireland is paramilitary led. Can you confirm that that's not the case, or is the case? And are you actively pursuing organisations outside of the paramilitary framework?
So for the exact breakdown, Mark, I can see Mark leaning forward as you ask the question, will be well placed to answer it. From where I sit, and with less information than Mark, it's definitely not all paramilitary, although there's definitely a large part of paramilitary. There is definitely a whole series of international connections. So when we are looking at our investigations, it's drug OCGs that stretch across the world. Either directly because of their hierarchies or because of their networks, and those link into ones that are kind of local here. And that is where, and Mark hinted at this earlier on, that is where we can have some of our best impact. We're not going to be better at investigating OCGs in Northern Ireland than PSNI. This is a big and really impressively capable force with brilliant officers. But we can provide some extra capabilities in terms of linking into the rest of GB, the rest of UK in GB, and then linking internationally with the relationships that we have right around the world.
Okay, thank you. And Mark?
Well, yeah, it was just the figure I quoted earlier was 39% at the moment. That fluctuates as we, monitor the organised crime group activity, but it's generally in around less than half is paramilitary related, and the rest of the impact in Northern Ireland is from wider organised crime groups. Could I just say, Chair, as well, in connection to Trevor's question, to publicly recognise and thank the NCA for their support during Sanucade. And there's a huge effort made by the NCA and other partners in supporting us, and that it's gratefully received.
Thank you. Okay. Nuala.
Thank you, Chair. And my questions around modern slavery and human trafficking. In the report, you noted that there was a reduction in the number of the disruptions, in part due to the redistribution of resources to tackle a significant threat from small boats and organised immigration crime. I'd like to ask just a little bit about that, whether that organised immigration crime is specifically crime related to slavery and human trafficking, or is it what we're talking about illegal immigration. I am concerned then that there is a prioritizing. I've seen you shake your head, so I'm concerned that it's prioritizing this immigration rather than actually prioritizing people who have been trafficked. And I think that is rather shameful, to be perfectly honest. And I wanted to know if you could elaborate further on why there has been a significant decrease in safeguarding visits. Whenever you compare the last Q1 and Q2 compared to Q3 and Q4, because I think it was 19 down to 19 from 44. You know, that is a big drop, you know, from the end of last year, start of this year, compared to the last 2 quarters in this year.
Happy to answer the first part of the question. On the second, if you could just remind which figures, the 19 to 44, which one that is?
On the safeguarding visits that were conducted in relation to the human trafficking and modern slavery. So in Q3 and 4, 22-23, it was 44. But in Q1 and 2 and 23, it was 19.
Fine. So on that, I don't really have the detail. I'll have to come back to you.
Could it
may
correlate
be
to it wouldn't correlate to the
it could do, or it may have been just the intelligence that we had to particularly feed it in that 6-month period. I'm not sure Mark might know more about it. If not, I'll happily come back to you on the first. Yeah, I mean, it is about prioritization, not directly between those two threats, modern slavery and human trafficking, and organised immigration crime, which absolutely can overlap, but can also be entirely separate. But we have to prioritise, as every organisation does all the time, between the different challenges. What we saw last year was, if you look over the last 3 years, an increase from hardly anyone, I mean, literally handfuls coming in on small boats into largely Kent, up to 45,000 people coming in small boats in 2022. It looks like it'll be around 25 to 30,000 this year, so it's come down this year. That is all. It wasn't in the very first smatterings of it. It was when it very first started. It was organically organised by migrants who were wanting to come to the UK, which of itself is illegal, but wasn't organised crime. But now it is very much organised by organised criminals who are helping people get across Europe, and then procuring and providing the tools to then get across the channel in terms of small boats and engines in quite an organised effort that is clearly exploiting the individuals. I mean, they are paying a lot of money to do this, and it is putting them at enormous harm. So that is organised criminality, and it is an enormous threat to life. So it's an important thing for us to be focusing on. It's always difficult when you get into the relative prioritisation, but we had to switch resources from a series of areas, one of which is modern slavery and human trafficking, to make sure that we were dealing with what was a very quickly growing threat. So we did that. What we have done, though, is recognise that we have seen a dip in modern slavery and human trafficking, and a bit more in some of the other threats that we've looked at as a consequence of the decisions we've made. So we're working out how we can address that. There has been some good activity on modern slavery and human trafficking, including in Northern Ireland. And actually, last week we ran an intensification. We have a thing called AIDENT, which is a series of it's an overall program name for intensifications we do 2 or 3 times a year around a particular sector where there may be modern slavery or human trafficking happening. We did one last year or the year before around the adult sex industry, which touched Northern Ireland quite a lot. But the one we've done recently is about trafficking through the common travel area. And that was last week. There was a series of activity, NCA coordinated, but largely PSNI with Border Force, linking into the Garda in the south as well. And we haven't got the results from that yet. That's only just happened. But to try and spot where there is exploitation, the routes that are being used, safeguard people as and when we find them, but actually in this case more to raise our intelligence and understanding of what's happening. So, I mean, perfectly fair challenge, still something that really matters to us. When we have tilted the resources, which we have to do at times to new priorities, it's had a bit more effect there than we wanted, so we're trying to tilt back.
Thank you for that update, and particularly for the recent examples. I think that is helpful. And just to note that I didn't think that it was not being prioritized. You know, it was not important. But in terms of the priorities, do you think that or do you think was that, and maybe getting into the political arena because of pressure, particularly from the Home Office, to prioritise this issue? because to me, you know, those people who have been trafficked and those who are essentially being trafficked into the UK, Northern Ireland, and are living quite horrific circumstances, have to be the priority when it comes to this issue. And is that due to influence, particularly from the Home Office?
So it's three things, I think. So one, our job is to enforce the law. Parliament sets the law. It decides what is illegal in immigration and what isn't, and it's changed the law. So we have to react to that. Secondly, there absolutely is, from an entirely apolitical standpoint, organised criminality involved in this that is making significant money and that is putting people's lives at risk in the journeys, as we've tragically seen across the Channel. And so, irrespective of any political pressure or prioritisation, we would have wanted to be addressing that. There's a question about how much resource you put into that versus other things, but of course we would want to be addressing it. The third factor is political prioritisation. So the way that we are set up, our law, the Crime and Courts Act that set us up, allows the Home Secretary to set our strategic priorities in the same way that Police and Crime Commissioner would set it for a police force in England and Wales. And you have arrangements here for doing likewise. And one of the priorities that the Home Secretary set for us, and there were 6, was to deal with illegal immigration and small boats. So a perfectly reasonable part of kind of political prioritisation and direction to the agency. I then interpret that into our operation. So she sets the strategic priorities, or he now, sorry, but it was a she when they were set. And then I set the operational priorities for the organisation. So those are the 3 factors that impinge on why we decided to do it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Just before we close the public session, you mentioned nitazines and meta end-to-end encryption. It hasn't come up in questions yet, but there were a couple of points you wanted to touch base on there.
Sure, and for time I can expand on them in private session. I'm sure stomachs will be rumbling too, but very briefly, we have been in negotiations, we, the NCA, but law enforcement globally and the UK government with Meta, who announced a while ago a plan to introduce end-to-end encryption on Facebook Messenger. It appears that they have announced today that they are going to go ahead with doing that. That is something that we are very disappointed by and very uncomfortable with. Meta have been a really important partner with law enforcement globally in trying to reduce child sexual exploitation. They produce a huge number of cyber tips, kind of alerts, into an organization in the US called NECMEC that then distributes them to law enforcement around the world, where they have spotted on their systems child abuse imagery or discussions being promulgated. That comes into us as a result of that information and other information. So it's not just Meta's, but they are a major contributor. We arrest roughly 800 people a month and safeguard around 1,200. We, NCA and police forces around the UK, safeguard 1,200 children a month. As Meta introduce end-to-end encryption, they have looked at and say they are implementing a number of additional safeguards to mitigate the impact, but we very strongly expect that those numbers will plummet. What they are doing now is putting easier mechanisms for children to report themselves that they are being exploited. Some will, many won't, and they will do some metadata searches, which will produce probably lots of material, but nothing massively useful for us. And this is deeply disappointing and quite worrying to our ability throughout the world, but definitely in the UK and Northern Ireland, to protect children.
Okay. And the
nitazines. So I should go into this in much more detail. For now, I'm just conscious of time.
Okay. That's
I'll be very brief then. For now, conscious of time, this is a real potential threat for the future. There have not been any nitazine deaths in Northern Ireland recently. There have been 3 historically, but not in the last period. There have been 44 in the UK. It is a form of synthetic opioid. It is between 10 and 20 times more powerful than fentanyl, which has killed 75,000 people in the US last year. There is a real risk of it coming into the UK. We've seen some in the Republic. There was overdoses in Dublin last month. It will come here. And we need to be working incredibly hard to stop it taking hold, because the levels of deaths from drugs will increase very markedly if it does manage to take hold. So we can come back to that in more detail, but it is a really important issue for us to worry about.
Okay. Thank you very much. Chief Constable, Director General, thanks to you and your teams for taking questions and for their ongoing work on behalf of the community. I can't thank you enough. Christmas thanks, I have to say to everybody. This is our last, hopefully, our last board meeting before Christmas. So can I take this opportunity to wish everyone a safe and peaceful Christmas and extend board thanks to all those within policing, the NCA, and all the other emergency services who will be working over the festive period and New Year to keep us all safe. Please follow their guidance and advice. Thanks also to those joining us online and here as well in the room. That concludes today's session. Our next scheduled board meeting is the 8th of February 2024. Thank you.